Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, and today we're diving into some seriously cool sim racing tech.
Yeah.
The Thrustmaster T598 wheel.
Yeah.
And I know you, our listeners, you love to be in the know about all the latest stuff. And this wheel, it's got a completely different approach to force feedback. They're calling it direct axial drive.
Yeah. It's a pretty wild concept.
Yeah, so our mission today is to basically cut through all the technical jargon and figure out exactly what this tech is, how it compares to what we already have, and most importantly, what it feels like when you're actually behind the virtual wheel.
Yeah, that's the key, right? Like at the end of the day, it's all about that feeling in your hands when you're
Exactly,
racing.
the real-world experience.
Exactly.
So let's get right to it. What is the Thrustmaster T598? Give us the rundown.
Okay, so the T598, it's a brand new sim racing wheel made for PlayStation 4 and 5 and also PC, so it covers all the bases.
Nice.
And comes as a complete package. You get the wheelbase itself, an 11.8-inch steering wheel rim, they call it the sport car rim, and their Raceline pedals LTE, which right now it's a two-pedal setup, but they're planning to release a load cell brake pedal as an add-on in 2025, so that's something to look forward to.
That's cool. So you basically get everything you need to start racing right out of the box.
Yep, pretty much.
What about connecting other accessories? Like shifters and stuff?
Oh yeah, it's got you covered there too. It uses Thrustmaster's new direct drive quick release system. So if you're already part of their ecosystem or thinking about expanding your options, this wheel fits right in.
That's good to know for sure.
Yeah, and the whole package, the wheel, the pedals, everything comes in at $499 USD, which is pretty competitive when you think about what you're getting.
Yeah, definitely, especially for direct drive.
Exactly, and shipping is set to start in November of this year.
All right, so that price point is definitely something to keep in mind as we go deeper into the features.
For sure.
Now, obviously, the big thing everyone's talking about is this direct axial drive. But before we jump into that, maybe we should do a quick recap of the force feedback technologies that most sim racers are familiar with.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It'll give us some context.
Right. So what are the main types of force feedback systems we usually see in sim racing wheels?
Okay, well, before direct drive became more affordable, most wheels used either belts or gears to transmit the motor's power to the steering shaft.
Right.
And since the T598 is a direct drive wheel, let's focus on belt-driven systems, just to kind of set the stage.
Sounds good.
So in a belt-driven wheel, you have motors that are connected to the steering column via belts and pulleys. The advantage here is that it's very cost-effective, so manufacturers can use more budget-friendly motors and offer force feedback at a lower price point.
Okay, so it's a way to get that force feedback experience without spending a ton of money.
Exactly.
But what are the downsides of using belts?
Well, the trade-off is, in the quality of the feedback itself, belts can introduce a bit of lag, a delay between what's happening in the game and what you feel in your hands.
Right.
They also tend to smooth out some of the finer details of the car's behavior, so you get a less nuanced and somewhat muted driving experience.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen. Belts can stretch and absorb some of that feedback detail.
Exactly, and that's why belt-driven wheels, although they're great for entry-level sim racing, often lack some of the finer sensations that you'd get with a more advanced system.
That makes sense. So now let's talk about these radial flux direct drive wheels that have become so popular. They're generally considered the high-end option these days, right?
Absolutely. Radial flux direct drive wheels, they're a huge step up from belt-driven systems. In these wheels, the motor is directly connected to the steering column, so there are no belts or pulleys to introduce lag or absorb detail. This direct connection results in much stronger and more responsive force feedback, and for quite some time, this was like the gold standard for consumer sim racing wheels.
Well, they're the real deal.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But then why is Thrustmaster going in this different direction with their axial flux design? What are the limitations of radial flux direct drive that made them explore this new approach?
That's where things get really interesting. See, while radial flux motors are super effective, they do have some inherent challenges.
Okay, like what?
Well, one major issue is heat generation. These powerful motors can get really hot, which makes the design more complex and expensive because manufacturers have to build in cooling solutions.
Right, I can see how that would add to the cost.
Exactly. And there's also the risk of the motor's power being reduced or throttled to prevent overheating, which can impact performance, especially during longer races.
So it's a balancing act between power and heat management.
Pretty much.
Are there any other limitations we should know about with radial flux motors?
Yeah, there are a few. Radial flux motors can sometimes experience magnetic saturation and eddy currents. These are basically effects within the motor that can slightly reduce the clarity and strength of the force feedback signal.
Interesting.
So engineers have to come up with ways to minimize these effects.
I see.
And then there's cogging, which is this kind of jerky or notchy feeling you might notice as the magnets in the motor interact. Software algorithms can help smooth this out, but some people argue that these algorithms can also mask some of the genuine force feedback detail.
So it's a bit of a trade-off there as well.
Right.
Okay, so now that we have a good understanding of the existing technology, let's dive into the heart of the T598, this direct axial drive. What's the fundamental difference between how it works compared to radial flux?
The biggest difference, like the name suggests, is how the magnets are arranged inside the motor. In an axial flex motor, the magnets are aligned on the same axis as the wheel shaft.
Okay.
This is completely different from radial flux designs, where the magnetic field flows radially perpendicular to the shaft. So this axial arrangement basically changes everything about the motor, its shape, how it works internally, and how it generates torque.
So it's a completely different way of generating force, which could lead to some pretty unique performance characteristics.
Exactly.
So instead of a traditional cylindrical motor sitting next to the shaft, we're probably looking at something flatter and wider.
You got it. For a given amount of torque, axial motors tend to be wider and thinner compared to radial motors.
Makes sense.
And it's worth noting that axial motors themselves aren't exactly new technology. Thrustmaster points out that they've been used in various industrial applications for quite a while, but using them in consumer products, particularly sim racing wheels, that's relatively recent thanks to advancements in manufacturing techniques.
So it's like taking this existing technology and adapting it for a whole new application.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. So what are the main advantages that Thrustmaster is highlighting with this axial flux design? What are the big selling points?
Okay, so they're claiming some pretty impressive benefits. First, because of their design, axial motors are supposed to generate torque more efficiently.
Okay.
This means they can achieve similar power levels using less copper, and here's the kicker, they produce less heat compared to a radial flux motor.
Oh, wow. So that addresses one of the big limitations we talked about earlier.
Exactly, they're tackling the heat issue head on.
That's a big win.
And another huge claim is a massive reduction in cogging over 99%, they say.
Oh, wow, 99%. That's almost completely gone.
Right. It's pretty remarkable, and this means you should get a much smoother and more precise force feedback signal without relying as heavily on software to mask that mechanical roughness.
So the feedback should feel much more natural and detailed.
That's the idea.
That's really impressive.
Yeah.
So a smoother, more responsive direct drive experience with less heat and potentially at a lower cost.
Yeah.
That sounds almost too good to be true.
Well, there are always trade-offs, and in this case, one of the main trade-offs is the physical design of the wheelbase.
Yeah.
But yeah, on paper, it sounds incredibly promising.
Okay, so less cogging, less heat. What else are they emphasizing?
Another interesting claim is enhanced performance through what they call controlled overshoot.
Controlled overshoot. What is that exactly?
So it refers to the motor's ability to briefly deliver a lot more torque than its continuous output. Imagine like a sudden burst of power.
Okay, I'm following you.
Thrustmaster says their axial motor can use this overshoot very effectively, resulting in faster and more accurate feedback, especially during quick changes in grip or direction, like when you're pushing the car to its limits.
So it's like an extra layer of detail and realism and the force feedback.
Exactly, and they've actually published some technical documents that go into the nitty-gritty of these differences, which is awesome for anyone who really wants to geek out on the engineering side of things.
That's cool. I'll have to check those out. So it seems really promising in theory, more efficient, less cogging, faster response. But are there any potential drawbacks to this axial flux approach, specifically when it comes to using it in a sim racing wheel?
Yeah, there are some practical considerations. One of the main ones, and this is directly related to the motor's design and the need for a certain stator radius to produce the necessary torque, is the physical size and shape of the wheelbase.
Okay, so how does that translate to the actual wheelbase? What does it look like?
Well, the T598's base is definitely different from more traditional direct drive wheels. It's thin and wide, yes, but it's also quite tall, over 12 inches in height.
Wow, that is tall. So how might that unusual shape affect the user experience? Is it a problem?
It could be. The reviewer we're referencing specifically mentions that the height of the wheelbase can actually block the lower part of the screen, especially if you're using a typical driving rig setup.
Oh, I see. So depending on your rig and your seating position, this could be a real issue.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about if you're considering this wheel. You need to make sure it'll fit comfortably in your setup without obstructing your view.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Were there any other practical challenges encountered during the review?
Yeah, mounting the wheelbase to a rig was a bit tricky. The bolt pattern on the bottom of the T598 wasn't compatible with the reviewer's Obudo rig,
Oh no.
but thankfully Thrustmaster includes a metal bracket that's mostly for their table clamp system, but it can also work as an adapter for rig mounting.
Okay, so there's a solution, but it might not be ideal for everyone.
Right, the bracket adds even more height to the unit, which could make that screen obstruction issue even worse. And in the reviewer's case, the bracket could only be secured to the rig using 2 bolts instead of the usual 4.
So that might raise some concerns about stability, especially with strong force feedback.
Yeah, it's a valid concern.
Okay, so we've talked about the tech, the design, and some potential challenges. Let's shift gears now and talk about how this wheel fits into the wider sim racing world. What about compatibility with other gear?
Well, the T598 uses Thrustmaster's new direct drive quick release standard, which is great news if you're already invested in their ecosystem or planning to be.
Okay.
It's compatible with all their wheel rims that use this new standard, and the quick release mechanism itself is supposed to be very easy to use. It gives you a secure and solid connection.
That's always important. You don't want your wheel flying off mid-race.
Exactly. And on the back of the wheelbase, you'll find all the usual ports power connections for a handbrake or shifter, the pedal connector, and a USB-C port for your PC or PlayStation.
Standard stuff.
Yep, and there's also an extra unused port, which suggests they might add compatibility with other accessories in the future.
Oh, that's cool. Always good to have options.
Right. And another handy feature is the automatic sleep wake function. So you don't have to constantly reach for a power button.
Nice little quality of life improvement.
Exactly.
Okay, so these days, more and more sim racing wheels are incorporating extra features like buttons and displays. What about the T598? Does it have any of that?
Yeah, it does. It has a small digital race dash screen built right into the wheelbase. And the reviewer was actually really impressed with it. They said it's bright, colorful, and very clear.
Wow, that's good to hear.
It can show you essential info like your gear RPM and even some wheel configuration settings.
Handy.
Yeah, and given that the tall wheelbase might block part of your main screen, this integrated display becomes even more important for keeping track of your telemetry.
It's like a backup screen, just in case.
Exactly. And then you also have buttons on the wheelbase itself that let you access things like the firmware version, adjust force feedback settings, and even switch between different saved profiles on the fly.
Wow, so you can fine-tune the wheel's behavior while you're racing.
Yep, that's right. It's super useful for adjusting to different cars, tracks, and even just personal preferences.
That's awesome. All right, let's move on to the part you actually hold on to the steering wheel rim itself. The T598 comes with this sport car rim. What were the impressions of its quality and design?
Unfortunately, the sport car rim seems to be the least impressive part of the package, at least according to the review.
Oh, really? That's a shame.
Yeah, it might look cool at first glance, but the materials they use are kind of disappointing. The top and bottom sections are made of hard plastic, and the sides have this soft touch material that apparently feels pretty cheap.
It's a bit of a letdown. Were there any other design aspects that stood out negatively?
Yeah, there are some ergonomic issues. The reviewer mentioned uncomfortable screw holes on the back of the rim where the different plastic pieces are joined together.
Ouch.
Yeah. And there's also this noticeable seam that runs around the rim, and you can actually feel it while you're driving.
Not ideal.
And the buttons on the rim, they lack clear tactile feedback, so it's hard to tell if you've actually pressed them. And the directional pad is cramped, which can lead to accidental presses.
Okay, so not the most ergonomic design.
Not really.
And button placement is also super important for quick access during a race. How was the layout on the sport car rim? Intuitive.
It's actually kind of weird and potentially confusing, at least at first.
How so?
Well, the PlayStation buttons, the ones you'd expect to find on the right side opposite the D-pad, they're actually located along the top of the rim.
Oh, that's strange.
Yeah. And in their place on the right are these encoder buttons, which do different things depending on the game you're playing.
That sounds like it could take some getting used to.
Yeah, the reviewer said they kept hitting the wrong buttons at first, but they also said that you'd probably adapt to it over time.
I guess so. But were there any good things about the included rim? Anything that stood out positively?
Oh yeah, for sure. The metallic paddle shifters, they were a definite highlight. They're magnetically activated, and they have this really solid feel with a satisfying click when you use them.
Nice, so at least the shifting feels good.
Definitely. And remember, the wheelbase is compatible with other Thrustmaster rims that use the direct drive quick release. So if you don't love the sport car rim, you can always upgrade to something else down the line.
That's good to know, for sure. Options are always good.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about the pedals now. The T598 comes bundled with the Raceline pedals, LTE. What were your initial thoughts on these?
The pedals are definitely a more positive part of the package. They have a solid metal frame and they're adjustable so you can customize them to fit your preferences.
Nice.
There's a bit of assembly required. You have to put the springs in place, but this lets you adjust the travel and resistance of the pedals.
Oh,
And they even include 2 different springs for the brake pedal so you can make it stiffer if you want a firmer feel.
oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so you have a bit of flexibility there.
And how did they actually feel in use, especially compared to higher-end pedal setups?
The reviewer who usually uses load cell brakes was actually pleasantly surprised by the Raceline pedals LTE.
Really?
Yeah, they said the pedal travel felt good, and the brake pedal had a decent amount of resistance, even without a load cell.
Interesting.
So for a bundled set of pedals, they seem to be pretty decent.
That's good to hear.
Oh.
And we know there's a big upgrade plan for these pedals, right?
Yes, Thrustmaster has said they'll be releasing a load cell brake pedal accessory for the Raceline pedals LTE sometime in 2025.
So that's a pretty significant upgrade path for users.
Oh yeah, for sure. A load cell makes braking way more realistic because it measures the force you apply instead of just the distance the pedal travels.
Right, it's a whole different level of feedback.
Exactly. And with this upgrade, they might even be able to repurpose the existing brake pedal as a clutch pedal, giving you a full 3-pedal setup.
Wow, so these pedals could potentially become a really high-end option. Okay, so the moment of truth, the driving experience. What was it actually like to drive with this new direct axial drive system? What stood out?
Well, the first thing the reviewer said was that it feels different from traditional radial direct drive wheels. They use words like fast, clear, and responsive.
Those were all good things.
Right. And they also noted that the wheel spins more freely compared to some radial direct drive wheels they've tried, which is probably due to the way the axial motor is designed. So there's this sense of a more pure force feedback signal coming through, which makes you feel more connected to the car and the speed.
That's awesome.
Oh.
So were there any specific force feedback effects that were particularly noticeable or well done?
Yeah, Thrustmaster talks about a feature they call harmony, which is basically the high-frequency harmonic vibrations that the wheel produces.
Okay.
And the reviewer was really positive about this. They said the vibrations were pronounced and well implemented, although they did say that Logitech's True Force system is still a bit more sophisticated overall.
Makes sense.
And on the other end of the spectrum, the controlled overshoot is super noticeable. It's that brief burst of extra torque when you're making quick movements.
Right.
And it can feel a little exaggerated depending on your settings, but it's definitely there, and it adds to the intensity of the experience. The T598 is supposed to have 5 Nm of constant torque with the ability to deliver over 100% overshoot.
So it can really kick when it needs to.
Oh, yeah.
So it sounds like it's strong at both the high and low ends of the force feedback spectrum. The fine vibrations and those sudden jolts. What about the middle range of forces?
That's where the reviewer felt the T598 might be a little less pronounced. The more subtle mid-range force feedback effects didn't seem to stand out as much as the other stuff.
Interesting.
It's possible that they could improve this with software updates, and some drivers might actually prefer this kind of force feedback profile, but it was something they noticed.
Okay, fair enough. Responsiveness is obviously crucial in sim racing. How did the T598 perform in that area? How quickly did it react to what was happening in the game?
This was actually one of the reviewer's favorite things about the T598, the wheel's slew rate, which is basically how fast it can change its force output, is incredibly fast.
So it reacts really quickly.
Super quickly. And this allows for very quick and intuitive steering corrections. It gives the wheel a really crisp and direct feel. The reviewer said it helped them react faster to oversteer and maintain better control overall.
That's what you want in a sim racing wheel.
Exactly.
Are there any other unique force feedback features worth mentioning?
Yeah, there's a feature called gear jolt, which is supposed to simulate the feeling of gear changes with a jolt through the wheel.
Okay.
But the reviewer felt it was a bit too strong and distracting, even at its lowest setting, especially when driving slower cars with less aggressive gear changes.
So it's a cool idea, but maybe not perfectly implemented.
Yeah, it could use some refinement.
Okay, so taking everything into account, what's the overall value proposition here? We know Thrustmaster is introducing a new technology at a competitive price point.
Right.
What are the key takeaways?
Well, the reviewer seemed pretty positive overall. They applauded Thrustmaster for trying something new and pushing the boundaries of sim racing tech.
That's good to hear. It's always good to see innovation.
For sure. And at $499, the T598 is a really good deal. You're getting a PlayStation-compatible direct drive wheel, a set of pedals, a table mount, and it's from a reputable brand. And all of that for less than many other direct drive options out there.
Yeah, that's a lot for the money.
It is. And the Axial motor delivers some unique and potentially desirable performance characteristics, particularly that super fast response and the strong overshoot effect.
Right, but as we've discussed, there are some compromises to reach that price point.
Of course, the biggest one being the quality and design of the included sport car rim, and the tall wheelbase could be an ergonomic issue for some people.
So potential buyers need to weigh those pros and cons carefully. Okay, so to sum it all up, our deep dive into the Thrustmaster T598 has revealed a really interesting and potentially game-changing technology, direct axial drive. It comes at a very compelling price and offers some unique performance benefits. But there are some trade-offs to consider.
Exactly. And for you, our listeners, the key is to think about what you value most in a sim racing wheel. Is it the super detailed force feedback, the sheer strength of the forces, or is it about getting into a direct drive ecosystem without spending a fortune?
Those are all valid considerations.
They are, and the T598 offers a unique blend of performance and affordability. So it could be a perfect fit for some people depending on their priorities.
That's a great way to put it. It all comes down to individual needs and preferences.
Absolutely.
And this whole thing raises a bigger question. As this axial flux motor technology continues to develop and maybe appears in other sim racing products, how will it change the future of force feedback and the overall sim racing experience?
Yeah, that's a really exciting thought. It's definitely something we'll be keeping a close eye on.
For sure. It's a fascinating development. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Thrustmaster T598.
Always a pleasure.
And until next time, happy racing, everyone.
Keep it on the black stuff.
See.
Later.